Right, thank you. I'll be talking about decentralized energy resources and specifically electrical energy resources, how you should control them and how that's going to make smart energy grids a reality. But this story starts with people. Everyone has different level of engagement with energy. I personally like knowing exactly what I do, how my actions, my appliances influence it. I know many of you, and especially many people out there, couldn't care less. They might be on a very expensive tariff and like it just like that. People have different motivations. People might be, might have lost their trust in the big energy corporations and want to take back control, supply their own energy. People might think that society is not moving quickly enough to deploy renewable resources. So in recent years, the costs of renewable resources have plummeted. And that has meant that people can now convert these preferences into actual actions. And the results are that now we have in the UK over 800,000 small solar PV installations, mostly on rooftops. We have nearly 100,000 electric vehicles on the road. And we have a budding home energy storage market. In addition, it's not just individuals, it's also community groups, over 5,000 of them, doing all things from running local windmills to having local heat networks or giving energy advice. So if you add to these developments also large national deployments of, say, offshore wind, you get truly incredible numbers for renewable energy. So comparing to 59 gigawatts conventional capacity we see for wind, we now have 15 gigawatts installed capacity, up from 5 in 2010. And last year that supplied 12% of our electrical energy. And that's massive growth, but for explosive growth, you should look at solar. Solar is now at 12 gigawatts, up more than 100 times from 100 megawatts in 2010. And it's breaking record after record after record. So just a few weeks ago, we had a new record where solar alone was powering 24% of electricity consumption. So all of this is connected still to the national networks. And in particular, I'm looking at electricity for now, National Grid, a number of them here, is responsible for keeping this electricity grid up and running. And that involves many, many different things. But one of the things it involves is balancing supply and demand on short time scales down to a few seconds. And if you think about it, so once you add large amounts of solar and wind to this system, right, you get larger fluctuations, you get less predictability, and you get even less time to make the corrections necessary. So thinking about this, the role of National Grid is really changing from that of a captain of an oil tanker, slow and steady, steering the ship, to that of a Formula One race car driver, hands-on, all the time, reacting at even higher speeds. And this really is an example of what we call, at a high level, the energy trilemma. What we really want is a grid that has low carbon emissions, that is reliable, and is cheap. Now, usually, what happens in engineering terms is you can get two of these easily, usually at the expense of the other. So how do we combine this in a better way? Well, the answer is obviously being smart, but the key word here is being flexible, trying to unlock all sources of flexibility in the grid to make it easier to match supply and demand in real time. So that means using the output of large generators, quickly changing them, using large batteries, using hydropower, but particularly what I'm interested in is using demand response, right? Changing end users' demand to follow the available supply rather than the other way around. And to some extent, this is already happening, right? National Grid is creating new products all the time to cope with the request for additional flexibility. Large customers can already sign up to demand response contracts and get their power interrupted for a fee. And just to show that not everything needs to be a complex market instrument, in France, the grid operator sometimes simply asks people to be mindful of their electricity consumption in the evening. And that helps a great amount. So, summarizing all of this, what we get is a huge top-down push for more flexibility for devices, for people to respond to the needs of the grid. And we have a bottom-up push of people wanting to be engaged with energy, We have a bottom-up push of appliances and devices and new sources of energy or storage becoming available. So the question really isn't anymore whether we will have a grid with decentralized resources, but the question becomes, how will we control this grid? Do we opt for a central coordination scheme where we have a coordinator that orchestrates what everyone's doing? Or do we have a more democratized or perhaps anarchy-like system where everyone follows their own incentives? And really there are good arguments for either side of this debate. If you want the most efficient system, if you want the most transparent system, actually centralized is not so bad. But if you want, if you worry about your privacy, if you worry about your freedom, or if you perhaps are BA, British Airways has just found out to their detriment what some of the downsides can be of a centralized infrastructure when it fails. So there are arguments to go this way. So really what it means is we are currently at a crossroads. We now need to make choices how to design this system into the future. We will need to think about who the players are in this game, who is in charge, and ultimately, who would such a system benefit. So I will be your guide on this road today. So let me just say a few words about myself. My story started just before I started my undergraduate in physics. I was traveling in India. I was in a small bookshop and I found this book, Chaos. And it made a big impact on me because it showed beautifully how simple systems can lead to surprisingly complex, in this case, chaotic behavior. And that has led to a, I would say, lifelong interest in trying to understand how interacting systems can lead to very rich dynamics. Now, the first stop on this road for me was actually not power systems. This was biophysics. So I studied plant cells. I studied the internal skeleton of plant cells. And the bones, if you will, of this skeleton are stiff biomolecules called microtubules. And these microtubules, they interact with one another in such a way that they form a really neat aligned pattern. And really nobody really understands how in detail this worked. What was important to make this pattern appear? So what we did computer simulations, made mathematical models. Here's an image of such a simulation to try and tease out what was causing this alignment under which conditions. And there's lots of answers here. But let me say the most important thing. The most important thing is that nature has decided to rely on this fundamentally noisy mechanism to establish this pattern, which is critical for the development of plants, right? So it relies on something noisy to perform a critical function. And that's a question. Can we use some of that in maybe designing some of our man-made systems? Can we design the rules of the game in such a way that random interactions lead to the right outcome? So, with that in mind, I will now take you on this journey over the next 20 years, illustrating that step by step with my own research. So the first one is, first stretch of our journey is something that happens in the near future. Some of this is already nearing the market, on the market, and will reach maturity in 5 to 10 years. And this involves those elements of the grid that are already smart and connected. It's us. It's unlocking the flexibility that sits inside people. So as an example here, picture yourself, it's a winter evening, the grid is under severe stress, you are just about to load your washing machine and press start. So if you'd know that actually that might be a danger to the grid, would you maybe postpone till tomorrow, maybe the day after? You could, right? So from the grid's perspective, what you're doing is you're using your dirty laundry as a battery, right? So if they can characterize, if operators or suppliers can characterize this battery and know how to use it, that could be hugely beneficial for the companies involved, for ultimately for customers and for the planet in reducing CO2 emissions. So how do we do this in practice? Well, we all have heard of smart meters. Some of you might finally have one now. And the promise of smart meters is that we're going to get flexible tariffs, right? We are going to pay different amounts for energy different times of day. So what we did here, this was the UK's first dynamic time of use trial, low carbon London, where people received, 1,100 people here received smart meters, and a dynamic time of use tariff, which means that their prices for energy, they pay for energy, can change every day, every hour. And we use that to investigate whether we could incentivize them to move their electricity consumption away from the peak. So here what you see a timeline for a weekend, and we have in dark green the peak hours, 5 to 11 p.m., in which we charge them a very high price. And in between, you can just about see the light green bands, in which we charge them a very low price. And if you look at the two curves, the blue curve is what they would have done on a normal day, and the red curve is what they actually did. So you see here quite significantly that they move their consumption away from the peak into the off-peak hours. And this is about, on average, about 8% shift. That seems very little, but on the grid scale, that is a lot. But it's not just financial carrots and sticks that you can use. You can also use information. So a good example of this is Onzo, a London-based analytics company, in the audience here, I hope. They take a customer's consumption data and convert that into useful information that they show on an app. So that includes information about which of your appliances uses how much energy. It includes information on how you compare with your peers, and they also use it to generate personalized energy advice. So we're now working with them to try and quantify how this kind of information actually influences people's energy consumption. So both of these examples are applications of essentially data science, trying to understand people's behavior either collectively or individually, and try to convert that into useful models. That and the continuous learning, which was mentioned before, are step one, if you will. I think for a company to be really successful in this space, they will need to close the loop and essentially perform more experiments. So actively go out and perform new experiments to improve their models, right? Make models, improve models continuously. All the while keeping in mind, very importantly, privacy, because that's the place you can easily stumble. So that was the first stretch of our journey. We're now moving to the second stretch. This is all about the actual consumers of energy, which are your appliances. And this is a trend that, although some of the technology may be here, I think it takes a few more years to come to market, not just also for regulatory reasons and market reasons. So we've heard in a number of talks now how appliances are getting smarter and getting more capable, are able to communicate with the grid. So we get these appliances, they can start help consumers manage their energy consumption. And if they do that, they can get those that currently can't be bothered, they can get them on board with this energy revolution. But in this space, this tension between centralized and decentralized is becoming really important. So I'd like to illustrate that with an example that's close to my heart. This is about smart refrigerators. So we have a huge amount of refrigeration load on the grid. It's about 2 gigawatts, depending on time of day, 4 to 10% of load. This is a lot. And these fridges, the way they consume power is, the largest power consuming component is the compressor. And essentially what you see is that the compressor goes on and off in regular cycles. Now the critical insight here is, of course, that you can shift a little bit this cycle without impacting the cooling performance very much. And collectively, if you have this enormous load that you can shift, you have a very valuable resource on your hands. Now this is not new. This idea has been around for a long time. People have done various trials or products on a relatively smaller scale and used either, I think, decentralized or centralized approaches, and both have come up short in some ways, I think. So decentralized approaches tend to be less flexible. You can't use the full flexibility of your resource. And if you scale it up, they might create more problems than they solve. Centralized approaches are technically great from an engineering point of view, but they involve sending detailed data of your fridge to a central controller at all times. People are not always on board with that. And also, just when you need it most, your communication infrastructure might fail, and you might lose your resource on which you're relying. So in response to this, we came up with a solution that we call semi-autonomous control. So that kind of hybridizes these two approaches. So in this, we still have our central coordinator over there. The central coordinator now does not need to know exactly what every fridge is doing, which temperature it has. It just needs to know the kind of fridges that are out there. And on that basis, it can create a signal of intent. It tells all the fridges collectively, I would like you to rapidly drop your power consumption in this case, and then slowly recover. Then each fridge can take this signal, can interpret it in its own way, consistent with its own constraints. Fridges that are a bit warm might do a bit less. Fridges that are on the cool side can do a bit more. And if you do this right, then you get this beautiful convergence to the correct result. Right? So collectively, they can do the right thing. And the nice thing is, so this hybridizes these two approaches in the sense that you also don't exchange too much information, and it's quite robust. So I think that these kinds of single appliance type aggregations, right, thousands or hundred thousands of fridges and other appliances can be used really well in this time frame to supply grid services. All the Google Nests together can provide a service like this. And we might be able to generalize this semi-autonomous algorithm to those cases, definitely to things like air conditioners, maybe to electric vehicles. So that's what we're working on now. So let's now imagine somewhat further this world in 2037. Starting with a quick recap where we came from. On the left is where most of us still are today. We have a supplier. We don't really interact with them. Occasionally get a letter and you pay. We get smart meters. That gives us an information channel. It gives us a channel to exchange data and services. As we move to intelligent devices, we get multiple communication channels. One for your Nest, one for your smart fridge, etc. But all of these are fundamentally the same principle still. Right? We have a strict hierarchy structure. So now, speculating a bit, but going into the future, we might have these devices start talking to one another. They can exchange measurements, they can exchange actions, they can maybe even trade with one another. Right? You might be able to tell your, let's say, toaster to buy electricity preferentially from your daughter's school because they have a PV panel on their roof and you'd like to support them. They, in turn, might use your electric vehicle battery to support their balancing. So in this case, we get information not just flowing up and down, but left and right. And we get decisions that are no longer made by any individual device, but between devices. So this is an interesting future. As an engineer, what are the challenges, right? So what should we be thinking about? So let's imagine we have another system which consists of many autonomous agents that act automatically with various objectives, and that's the financial system, right? Financial system, there's been great successes in automated trading. Very efficient, but sometimes things go wrong, right? We've seen in the 6th of May 2010, there was a large flash crash. Nearly 10% of the US stock market wiped out in a matter of minutes because of some unforeseen emergent behavior. So that's critical. We need to watch this. We need to watch what could happen if you add all these devices together. We need to design controllers that, to the best extent, anticipate and prevent this. We need to be able to monitor what's actually happening, whether the system works as we think it does. And finally, because we will get it wrong sometimes, introduce some kind of digital circuit breaker to gracefully bring the system back under control. Those are engineering challenges. But that's not the only thing. This system is ultimately, whatever choice we make, has large societal and potentially political consequences. So if we make this smart system, and let's say half of the people is self-sufficient, do we have the same reliability standards for the national grid? And if not, who's going to lose? Do you need the latest high-tech gadget to perform the best trades, or will you lose out on the best deals if you can't afford it? Also, from an oversight perspective, right? So can we, if we have all these devices talking to one another, do you really know where your data goes? Do you know who's playing what on which markets? Who's being anti-competitive? It's hard. And ultimately, and this has come up before indeed, who is responsible for the automated decisions that are being made, and especially if it's between different players. So as we go towards 2037, if we get it all right, if we engineers, scientists and businesses and civil society get this right, hopefully what we'll have is a system with a truly shared energy economy, where everyone and every device can plug in to the system and have it just work, even though the underlying complexity may be enormous. Hopefully that all goes under the hood and you won't see it. So from an end user perspective, what you have is a system in which you can preferentially trade with different partners if you want to, is a system in which the system anticipates your actions, but it hopefully won't punish you if you don't act according to its predictions, and a system in which you can control where your data goes. Maybe you don't want it to flow too far. And ultimately, this has to be a system that is transparent, that is in the background, is immersive, but allows you to dig down if you need it. So concluding, I think it's a very exciting area to be working on. It's a pleasure to be working on this and a privilege to be trying to make this happen. Thank you.
Fascinating, thank you very much. Just one or two questions coming in. Just interesting, something around storage. We're obviously doing a whole set about energy generation, yes, even on this building.
Yep.
But energy storage, battery, that's going to be a dimension and game changer as part of this conversation by 2037?
Absolutely.
And what's going on
there? Not by 2037. This is a game changer now and in the coming couple of years. The question is, how far up the stack can you play with it, right? So a local battery, you can buy these things now. You can't yet, as far as I'm aware, as an individual consumer, hook those up to make grid-scale services, but you have grid-scale batteries as well. So yeah, it's a huge factor, and also, in a way, the example of the laundry. Essentially, a lot of these things are the same. The battery is nice because it has specifications you can model, but the other types of response are, to some extent, batteries as well.
And presumably the storage is open to the decentralized agenda as well, is it?
Yes, I mean, yeah, so especially, well, currently I think it makes perfect sense if you want to be self-sufficient. You already buy a Tesla Powerwall or something similar now. Not sure if it makes economic sense just yet, but yes.
And just a little bit of clarification. You showed the sort of coordinated centralized system and then the democratized or decentralized system. Just a question of saying, just clarifying what the role of the system operator is in a decentralized system.
Right. So I would say, talking to them now, to some extent, I think especially as long as you have an AC core network, there has to be the final arbiter, needs to be the person in charge of that network, because everything is connected with everything and things go wrong in a distributed way. So someone needs to be in charge. That will need to be the system operator. Right. Perhaps in a further future we go to DC grids, we could have a different conversation. But yeah, they will still be there, yeah, as a stopper.
Some more questions coming in, but I'd like to reserve them for the bigger discussion. But
thank
for
you.
now, Simon, thank you very much indeed.
Thanks.
Thank you.